Hello, welcome to Pipeline Integrity, things that make me go, This is part 5 in my video series. My name is Colin Scott. I'm a pipeline integrity engineer based out of Calgary, Alberta, up north in Canada. Today we're going to be talking about both surface and through-wall crack assessments using the NG18 based equations. If those of you have seen video number 3, I focused on the surface crack assessments and I demonstrated that the original log-secant model for surface cracks is fundamentally overly conservative because it's got some mathematical wonkiness in it. Today I'm going to bring in the through-wall crack assessments, so that would be the model that's used for leak rupture boundaries, and I'm going to demonstrate why that one is correct and how these two models relate to each other. So here we have the log-secant model for through-wall cracks, and this is the one that would be used for leak rupture boundary analysis. We have a remaining strength, which is the predicted failure strength over the flow strength. We've got 1 over the Folius factor. We have a 2 pi, arccos exponential, k squared is our toughness. We've got an 8 factor, and c is the half crack length. Folius factor, as you should know by now if you've been watching these videos, is a length-based factor. Now what I like about this model, and it's fairly rare for me to say that I like something about the NG18 models, if you've seen my other videos, but what I like about this is that the entire model is based on length. It's theoretical, it's based on the strip yield model from the 1960s, it includes a Folius factor, we're dealing with a through-wall crack, everything is based on length. This makes me a very happy camper. If you do the validation against publicly available data, you'll find that this model is actually very, very good. No conservatism in it, everything lines up just the way it should. Now when I look at this, I'm going to focus on 3 key things. The first is it's using a Folius factor, and the Folius factor was derived for through-wall cracks, and looking at through-wall cracks getting longer. So that's good, I'm happy with that. It's also based on length, so we have C, the half crack length in there. And then the third thing, and this one is really the focus of video number 4, is I believe, and this is just based on my conjecture and logic and looking at some of the other data, I personally believe that the Sharpie over area correlation that's used in a lot of these models was done under plane stress conditions. Now, strictly speaking, that's not technically right. Toughness correlations should be done under plane strain conditions, but in this case it's okay because we're dealing with relatively thin wall pipe. If you think about it, the length tip that's looking to extend is going to be able to strain and pinch in radially, absorb energy, and end up with a higher apparent toughness. So this is all good. I'm happy with this model. So I give it the green light from top to bottom. Now if you've seen video number 3, you realize that I'm not a big fan of the log-secant model for surface cracks. We have a very similar format, but we've replaced that 1 over Folius factor for the 1 minus A over T, 1 minus A over T over M term. So that's the NG18 equation that I was bruising in videos number 1 and 2. Otherwise though, you'll see that the whole model here is exactly the same it was for the through-wall cracks, which makes me scratch my head a little bit. If I take a look at the log-secant model for surface cracks and I compare it to the 48 data sets that were prepared by Kiefner et al. For the Battelle data, I find that I'm going to get a very good correlation, except that it's conservative. It's about 12% overly conservative. And if you've seen video 3, I demonstrate why that is. It's because we're mathematically wonky. And that mathematical wonkiness comes in the form of a big chunk of that log-secant model for surface cracks is theoretical based on length. All that blue section there in the equation, that's really just the through-wall crack assessment model that's been Frankensteined into our typical NG18 term, which is empirical. So that to me doesn't seem to be the best way to do things. If we look at the same 3 factors that we looked at before, we're using a Folius factor based on length, even though it's not really relevant for a surface flaw. We're basing everything on length here with our C term, which is really not super relevant for a surface breaking crack. And then the Sharpie over area, which I believe was done under plane stress conditions, is much, much too high to be used for a surface crack. A surface crack should be under plane strain conditions, and you would expect a much, much lower toughness. But the whole model kind of sort of seems to mostly work. So let's think about why that is, and I'll give you the answer a little bit later on. I give a red light to this model for the three reasons I've just shown you. The three key parameters are based on length and based on plane stress conditions, and that is really not appropriate for a surface breaking crack under plane strain conditions. So let's think about this. If you've seen video number 3, you know that I had a good think about this already, and I came up with my own model, which I've nicknamed the gamma exponent model, and here it is. It looks very similar to the log-secant model for surface cracks, but there are a couple of key differences that you can see if you watch video number 3. There is some fine print. Again, I showed you that in video number 3. I'm just going to scan over it. And of course, I demonstrated earlier that the model is improved by about 10% by going to the GEM model as opposed to the NG18 equation, the log-secant model for surface cracks. I made the point in video number 3 that when I derived the GEM model, it's all based on theory and strip model solution, but it's all focused on surface cracks. It's all based on depth rather than length. So that, I think, is a step in the right direction. I've taken out the folies factor because it's simply not relevant. I'm using the wall and J under plane strain conditions, which will be a much lower toughness value, which is appropriate for a surface crack. If you think about the crack tip that's partway through wall of the pipe, it's not going to be able to strain in that axial direction in order to increase plasticity and give any apparent toughness. And I've switched out the crack length for a crack depth. So with all of three of those issues fixed, I'm giving myself the green light. Feel free to disagree with that, but that's where I am right now. Now let's think about what might have gone wrong here. Let's hypothetically consider if, and this is a big if, this is for discussion, what if my GEM model were actually correct? But somebody accidentally used a toughness value that was too high by 10 times because they had a bit of a plane stress versus plane strain oopsie. So that means maybe you're supposed to put in the wall and J formulation, but just accidentally, for whatever reason, somebody puts in the Sharpie over area plane stress relation, which, as we saw in video number 4, is about 9 times higher. You would think that putting in a number that was 9 times off would jump out at you and demonstrate that there was something fundamentally wrong with the model. But hypothetically, let's say that you also had a bit of an oopsie in that dimension, and you were using a dimension value that was too high by 10 times due to a length versus depth oopsie. So let's say that I had a crack that was, say, 3 millimeters deep by 60 millimeters long. That's about a reasonable crack dimension. Now, if you're supposed to put in the number 3 millimeters into that location in the math, but you accidentally put in a half crack length of 30 millimeters into that location of the math, you'd be off by 10 times. And you would expect that having a number that was off by 10 times would jump out at you and tell you that there was something wrong with the model. However, in this particular case, we have a number on top of a fraction that's 10 times too big, and we've got a number on the bottom of a fraction that's 10 times too big. And those two errors completely or mostly balance each other out. So my take on it is that the log-secant model that was developed for surface cracks is fundamentally wonky. It has 2 order of magnitude errors buried in it, but they're buried deep and they cancel each other out largely. Obviously, your length depth is not going to be exactly 10 times difference, but whatever that difference is, simply the mathematics is going to cancel out a good chunk of the error. And then if you think about it, the rest of that math is buried in an exponential equation, which is then buried in an arc cosine equation. So at the end of the day, you could have 2 fundamentally incorrect aspects of your model, but those 2 fundamental aspects of the model are largely balancing each other out, so you don't even know you've got a problem. So let's think about that. The NG18 work was developed about 50 years ago, and so these models have been used on pipelines all over the world. I've mentioned before, and I'm going to keep mentioning it, that the oil and gas industry is valued at something like $3 trillion, which is comparable to the GDP of, say, India or France or Britain. We have 2 million kilometers worth of pipelines around the world. Just looking at the transmission lines, they're either onshore or offshore. And then, of course, we'll have laterals, we'll have gathering lines, we'll have a lot of facilities piping. And if you think about it, there's an enormous value in those assets. If you think about it, though, we're using an equation here, and have been for 50 years, that has got two, I believe, fundamental errors in it, buried in it deep, and these two fundamental errors are largely canceling each other out. However, the heart and soul of these models that are being used is based on length rather than depth. I have a former boss who would describe the situation as suboptimal. The conservatism that's built into these models is nice because it's safe, but whoever's paying the bills on these is paying for an awful lot of repairs that really don't need to be done. I estimated for the corrosion side of things, the value of the overly conservative NG18 equations is probably something like $3 to $5 billion. I'm not sure what to guess for the crack side of things. I think for those countries that have a lot of older vintage pipelines from the 50s and 60s and 70s, there's probably an enormous amount of value to be gained by improving integrity assessments, particularly as those pipelines get older and older and those cracks fatigue and grow and cause all sorts of trouble. Something to think about. Now I'm going to give you a little homework assignment. I think if you've made it through 5 videos, you're probably pretty keen on this stuff, so I think that a lot of you will jump at it. The first is to perform a model validation exercise. And in the first set, we're going to take the Kiefner through-wall crack data. So that's 92 data points that were used for the leak rupture boundary analysis. And I mentioned earlier on that it actually works out very well, so there's a little hint for you. Use the log-secant model for through-wall cracks, as I showed you at the very, very start. And as a little switcheroo, just to make things interesting, I'm going to suggest use the Wall&J lower 5% toughness correlation, but divide it through by 1 minus 2 nu squared in order to convert it from a plain strain toughness value to a plain stress toughness value. So that's one half of the homework assignment. And then the second half will be to do a model validation using the Kiefner surface breaking crack data. So that's the 48 data points, and you've already seen those plotted a couple of times. We're going to do things a little differently here. I'm going to ask you to use my new gem model for surface breaking cracks, but, and this is just for a little exercise, rather than using the Wall&J lower bound 5%, as I always recommend, use that Sharpie over area correlation, but this time multiply it by 1 minus 2 nu squared. So that will take what I believe is a plain stress correlation, and it'll do the conversion to make it into an appropriate plain strain correlation. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be collecting these homework assignments. This is all going to be done, I think, on the honor system. Perhaps you can trade with some of your colleagues and mark each other's work, just like you would back in grade 5. I'll give you a little hint, though. If your homework is right, you will know it. You will know it. So a lot of YouTube videos that you'll see will have a disclaimer where they say this has been done by trained professionals. Do not try this at home, safety, etc. I do not have a disclaimer like that. I would like to encourage you to try this at home. I've given you a little homework assignment you can try if that's your thing, but I encourage you to take a look at the equations I've shown you, have a good think about the logic that I've tried to demonstrate, think about the theory, and think about the consequences of having an oil and gas industry which is doing all of its integrity assessments based on length rather than depth. I think that there's a lot to think about here. Please try this at home, and hopefully you can convince yourself I'm not a complete crazy person. If you are interested in this, I do have 3 real publications which you can track down. The last one there on the list is ASME's journal paper. That's where I go through the rigorous mathematics of deriving my new gem model, and I demonstrate where you get some of those, some of those changes from the NG18 work. So thank you very much for your time. If you've made it as far, I appreciate it. I hope you were able to follow some of my logic, and I hope it makes sense to you. Please feel free to play with your own numbers and see if you can get similar validation studies. I do have video number 6. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the basic NG18 sort of effective area term, and I'm going to demonstrate to you why that is actually mathematically very, very similar to my remaining ligament to the gamma exponent, because that really ties everything together. With this particular video, I've tried to demonstrate that it's quite possible that there are two inherent mistakes built into the models that have canceled each other out. But then there's still that unanswered question of what about the NG18 ratio term versus my remaining ligament to the gamma exponent term. We'll discuss that in video 6, so I hope you can grit your teeth and make it through that. Thank you very much for your time. Until next time, bye.